Good evening. My name is Paul Lowe. I'm a senior lecturer here at Melbourne School of Design. I would like to welcome everybody to the second lecture of the AA Visiting School. And before we commence, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owner of the lands on which this meeting is taking place, which may be multiple lands given the location of all of us. I pay my respect to both past and present and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present. So we're delighted tonight that we have with us Stefan Lagnes and Pablo de Santo as part of our second lectures for the AA Visiting School. Before we commence, I will ask Mon Q, who is the director of the AA Visiting School, to introduce our guest speakers. And towards the end of these lectures, we will have a Q&A session. So audience, if you could put your questions in the Q&A functions at the bottom of your screen, and Mon and I will moderate the questions to our speakers. So Mon.
Thank you, Paul. It is my pleasure tonight, or morning, to welcome you today, Stefan and Pablo. Stefan Lagnes is a London-based architectural researcher, artist, and former project leader at Forensic Architecture. He's a co-founder of Pantopia.xyz, an online educational platform for spatial thinkers, and his creative practice explores the consequences or opportunities brought about by the climate crisis regarding how we inhabit and engage with our built environment. Stefan currently teaches the Diploma Unit 9 at the Architecture Association in London, which they recently finished, and one of their students actually got honours, which is very exciting. Pablo de Santo is an experimental architect and multidisciplinary artist with long-term experiences in working with diverse communities across geographical and multidisciplinary borders. He was a co-founder of Hackatura.net, a group of architects, computer scientists, and activists who pioneered a wide range of experimental projects. He is the editor of 3 books and co-author of The Critical Cartography of the Straits of Gibraltar, and he's currently the visiting professor at the Federal University at Paraiba, postgraduate department of architecture and urbanism in Brazil. Excuse my pronunciation of that. And tonight, Stefan and Pablo will present their multifaceted exploration of the spatial politics of ecology and environmental restoration. Their practice sort of sits at the intersection between architecture, radical cartography, media art, and the environmental humanities to explore political ecology, more than human worlds, and multi-species entanglements. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Pablo and Stefan.
Thank you, Mon, for such a nice introduction, and thank you everybody for attending this lecture. The way I'll go is I will start introducing sort of my practice first, and then Pablo will introduce his, and then we'll finish by summarizing how this sort of comes together to shape the brief for this year's summer school. All right. So, as Mon said, I was a researcher at Forensic Architecture and a project leader at Forensic Architecture for 3 years, where I worked on projects, relatively large ones, such as investigating the enforced disappearance of 43 students in Mexico City and modeling airstrikes from the analysis of videos. For the last 4 years, I've also been teaching Diploma 9 at the Architectural Association, which is concerned with the consequences, the spatial consequences and opportunities that come about due to the climate crisis, both environmentally and politically and economically and culturally. So the way I chose to start is actually just to talk through a recent project that I've been working on, which kind of gathers together a lot of the aspects of my practice. So in 2019, I began exploring rewilding, which is a philosophy or a new approach to environmental restoration as a spatial and cultural phenomena in the context of the European Media Art Platform residency program. And this is an extract of sort of that video piece that I did. So I produced this video atlas which explores the relationship between environmental restoration and inhabitation in rural Europe, inhabitation of people. And this video atlas is composed of images, videos, interviews, collected during field trips in different parts of rural Spain. And what it presents in the two screens is two separate conditions. First, rural areas of Spain suffering from depopulation and land abandonment. And second, an indigenous community restoring their common woodland through collective action. And this latter example became really critical to the direction of my research. The way I like to operate is through direct engagement with a location, so with field trips. These are the pictures of the two locations that were important for this project. Both are actually sort of a form of common land community. The project also incorporates aspect of open source environmental sensing technology, which is something that I'm sort of continuously exploring. And in this particular case, it was, I was interested in exploring how to use normalized vegetation difference index cameras, which are usually used to infer the rate of photosynthesis of plants, so the health of plants, but to use it as a medium of exploration, of recording of these different field conditions. Maybe just an explanation of what that is. NDVI is a simple equation, which is that you make the difference somehow between a visible image, which is the visible light that we see, and an infrared image, and that reproduces an image in which every pixel is given a value between 0 and 1, and then to that gradient you apply false colors, and from that you can sort of infer, like I said, the health of vegetation and plants. I sort of strapped these open source cameras that I made to a large helium balloon, and I proceeded to fly them over these different parts of Spain, engaging one with the land itself and the environment around me, but also with the people in these different conditions. There was a lot of suffering involved doing this in the blistering heat of central Spain and the height of August by myself. And what emerges from this is that the atlas is kind of a tool to contextualize ongoing research and to make connections between disparate types of medias that I collect in my fieldwork. And for example, in the first projection, the subject of interest that I wanted to try to capture, try to sense, was this process of land abandonment and finding the traces of biocultural heritage, of abandoned sort of human occupation within these common land, and to find the form of signature of this type of process. And the second one, it was this indigenous community in Galicia. And there I had the privilege of attending a collective deforesting campaign to deforest particular invasive species. And here I wanted to, using the same techniques, I wanted to capture, the signature of an act of collective sort of restoration on a piece of land. So this was attempted with the NDVI cameras, but actually what emerges is it became more of a sonic signature, and the sonic signature is a counterintuitive one. It became the one of the intense use of chainsaws, which you can hear, I think, in this video. And so this project is very much in the realm of sort of research, but also translated into media art. But now I'll talk about why, it is what's particularly interesting about one of these given locations. So the last location that I had the privilege of going to was the small village of Frochan, which you see in this image. And Frochan is what's called a monte vecinal and mano común, or a common land community, which is nested in Galicia's Atlantic coast. It's a very small village. There are 18 inhabitants, but they derive their legal claim to their commons back to medieval manorial deeds. The document that you see on the right, I think, dates from 1400. And in the face of a lot of external pressures, both economically, but mainly environmentally, from climate change and the intensification of forest fires, this small community decided to start basically a full-blown transformation of their common lands, clearing invasive species, restoring sort of wetlands, planting new native species, in order to diversify their common land both economically and from a biodiversity standpoint. And in order to do so, they had to revisit ancestral practices to support their efforts, and their efforts have been recognized. In 2017, Freixan became the first community in Spain and the third in Europe to be included in the Indigenous Communities Conservation Area, which is the ICCA registry. And you can see in these images, these are ones taken on the ground, but then you can see them more on a cartographic scale, is actually the very sort of concrete strategic design decisions that they've taken in order to transform their land over what is a fairly long period of time, whether that's through fire barriers, where they strip entire parts of their land out, or through the strategic planting of trees. This notion of designing, actively designing and participating in the design of a territory becomes very interesting. But more importantly, Freixan also has a series of, I guess, cautionary tales or has some lessons for us from the past, which is that Freixan's history, even though it's doing well now in terms of generating an economic and culturally dynamic life, Freixan's history is really one of conflict and resistance to dispossession, which it continues to grapple with to this day. So the invasive eucalyptus tree, which was imposed, which is there as a monoculture now, which is imposed by the Franco dictatorship, it continues to accelerate and intensify forest fires. And the remnants of abandoned mines and abandoned but still officially active mining concessions continue to pose a risk to ground and water contamination, and keeps the risk of land dispossession by that mining company open. And throughout the region and in Europe as a whole, it's these pressures, specifically sort of environmental pressures and pressures from institutional and commercial bodies like this, that continue to erode the autonomy of rural communities as they struggle to sustain essentially a vibrant cultural life, which furthers a process of rural depopulation and land abandonment. And this is a really bad drawing, but it's something that I have at hand to keep as a reference. What's interesting about Freixan is that it can be read as a sort of a 1 square kilometer of process through resistance. And it's really a multi-layered microcosm in which to understand past, current, and future conditions of certain rural communities across Europe. And the restoration of 1 square kilometer of common woodland, like I said, represents really a continuous act of resistance through process and a concerted effort towards self-preservation. And what I think is really relevant about the example of Freixan is that it resonates with this quote here, which I'm not going to read in full, but it's a quote about environmental restoration by this French philosopher Marion Waller, and it's that restoration implies becoming totally alive and in tune with a zone. It requires us to sign up to being members of a biotic community and stop being its exploiters. And I think this quote really summarizes what the community of Freixan is doing, and what being part of that community, whether it is as somebody who lives there or somebody who sort of participates in their volunteering scheme, implies. That their act of rewilding, their act of environmental restoration, is really about human inhabitation at its core. It's about them being able to live within their land. So it becomes a project of societal development rather than just an ecological one. And the questions that emerge from Freixan for me is really like, what is the dynamic between environmental restoration and our built environments, whether that's through how we live, the infrastructures that we produce. How can we implement certain sort of models of land management and frameworks in order to actually really transform a territory? And the commons, right, as an active tool or an active device for territorial transformation, whether it is in Galicia or as one that can be translated or transferred elsewhere. That the commons isn't some sort of antiquated device in Europe that's sort of a leftover from medieval deeds, that it's actually something that can be utilized in a much more proactive way. And so this has led me on to more of a long-term investigation into how collective models of land ownership and stewardship for the purposes of ecological restoration can become key drivers to re-inhabit marginalized areas of Europe. And this question for me emerged as a response to two interrelated phenomena, which are currently unfolding across Europe, that are probably unfolding across other parts of the world as well. And the first one is rural depopulation and agricultural land abandonment. So the fact that people are getting older, people are leaving rural areas, and as a result, the land which used to be used for certain agricultural purposes is being sort of essentially abandoned. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And de-agriculturalized. I'm not sure if that's the right word. So that's the first phenomenon. And the second one is a growing interest in ecological restoration through, and this is very important, through private venture and land consolidation. That within Europe, there is, whether or not it's for environmental restoration, there is a trend towards large-scale land consolidation, so land being consolidated into private hands. And environmental restoration can fall very quickly under that purview because it is seen as a good investment. It can be seen as a bit of a trophy ownership, and there is exasperating sort of inequality that is happening in Europe, which translates into the way land is owned. And so rural Europe is currently facing challenges on many fronts, but the first one is that there's an intensification of agricultural practice, which accelerates the abandonment of unproductive agricultural land, while the lack of economic opportunities continue to hollow out and age its population, which is what I mentioned earlier. And today, 4 out of 5 citizens live in urban areas, and it is estimated that by 2030, up to 200,000 square kilometers of agricultural land will be at risk of abandonment. And that's not a small number. That's actually, I think, an area roughly the size of Romania or England or something, depending on where you sort of set the limit. And for me, that was a really striking figure, this idea that maybe as a constellation or as an archipelago, there would be this entire area of sort of a territory of potential, so to speak. And land abandonment is actually Europe's largest land system change. So land system change is how land use just changes over time, and this is the largest one. And these trends, depopulation, land abandonment, also contribute to the collapse of biodiversity through the destruction of habitats, through the use of pesticides, and land abandonment can also exacerbate disaster events such as floods and fires. And while this is happening, on the other hand, there is a growing consensus that large parts of Europe need to be ecologically restored to deal with climate stresses and to avoid ecological collapse. But there's a paradox that happens here, which is that it's those very demographic trends and land system changes which are exacerbating the ecological decline of Europe's rural areas. They are often touted as the opportunity for restoration projects by whether it's traditional conservation or new rewilding opportunities. So because there is nobody here, we now have a good incentive to consolidate large parts of land to dedicate to environmental restoration. And this is kind of a little bit of a problem because it's an outlook which remains neutral to the condition of these marginalized areas. And it fails to address the reasons why these areas are suffering in the first place. And those reasons are often, very different, which is the lack of investment, the lack of services, the lagging mobility and connectivity infrastructure, and lack of economic opportunity. And and here is an image that's produced by Rewilding Europe, which is a leading advocate for rewilding within Europe. And it's worth questioning this image alone that I pulled from their website, which they show. They have a series of these. And this is an area that I actually went to visit. And I think it sets up a little bit what the vision is for a group like them, that when you end up reading their literature, you realize that most of the examples that they advocate for are ones that are deeply rooted in models of private ownership, and particularly large-scale private ownership. And you have this land here where this sort of like safari kind of on all these animals, and at the forefront there's a predator. But the only traces of humans is actually this little tent that you see in the center of the image and this ruin at the back. But actually this area, I went there, it's got roads, it's got highways, it's got traces of fields that were cultivated in the past. And it does raise the question, which is, what is this vision of future environmental restoration in Europe, and in whose image is it being created, and for whose purpose? So who actually gets to interact and participate in this process, who actually benefits from it, and who is also represented or not represented in this? And looking at this, the image that we have here before us, one can ask, like, are we simply and going to end up being temporary spectators in a privatized land? And why are the models that they are sort of advocating for inscribed very much in sort of market systems without seeking to challenge them? And there seems to be in their discourse a really strong sort of focus on this notion of financialization of both the land but also the wildlife that sits on it. And through some field work, I tried to interact with sort of environmental restoration sites, and both physically and through research, and what I observed is the lack of a participatory spatial project when it came to ecological restoration. That initiatives were either sanctuarized, privatized, with various barriers of access to the areas in question. And when I say barriers of access, these can be indirect, so lack of transportation, rural gentrification, pay tolls, to direct, no access to the public at all. And this image kind of summarizes it. On the top left, you have a site in the UK that's been rewilded, at the center of which is one of Europe's largest onshore oil facility. So it's there's the prospect that this is a bit of an offset project. At the bottom, you have a site in the Netherlands, which is a big rewilding experiment, which is completely off limits to the public. And on the right here, you have sort of maybe the typical sort of profile of environmental conservation in the future, which is relatively wealthy private landowners. This is a case of a couple in the UK. And my interest in environmental restoration is not necessarily concerned with the question of how specifically environments need to be produced and what is nature, although that feeds into it. And as you'll see, Pablo will discuss how that is also relevant in this conversation. My current research is very much concerned with the political ecology of ecological restoration in Europe. So the dynamic between territorial organization, land use, and production of territorial projects. But what I think is important in this research that I'm trying to set up is that there is a bit of a focus on, not just learning from old models, but actually in the future trying to, propose new models or new narratives, at least, of territorial experiments, which can exist in between sort of these conditions that already exist, such as the intensification of urban areas, the intensification of agriculture, and the vision of a group like Rewilding Europe, that there is somehow a third territory, a territory of opportunity, of experimentation that exists in these abandoned lands, in these unproductive lands, in which we can produce these new models to, one, complement maybe the ones that are being currently produced, but in some cases, and as you saw in the case of Foshan, to actually actively resist certain models of land management, whether they are for environmental restoration or not. These two images here are sort of the beginning of trying to do that, which is trying to actually use geospatial data to construct a map or an image of this condition of territories of opportunity for environmental restoration. And the image on the left is sort of a detail into that, where geospatial data about land use has been modified to kind of start to create a collage of what these new models might start to look like, both graphically but also cartographically. And one of the questions is also like what that I have is, with territorial transformation and transformation of land management, stuff like that, there is also, I think, the transformation of individuals, the individuals that engage with that land, that engage with that process. And I think the community of Foshan and myself, while I was there, we were all part of that idea that we are transformed individuals by this process. We form a new form of citizen, a new form of collective. And all these ideas really kind of boil down, or they don't boil down, but they are very much present in my teaching at the Architectural Association in Diploma 9, I teach with Antoine Vaxelaire, who also did the summer school a few years ago. And the unit and my practice, we both kind of influence each other quite dramatically. I learn a lot from that, and I feed a lot of my own stuff into it. And these are kind of maybe 3 points that really stick out. This idea of, advocating and pushing for projects of territorial transformation, where architecture and the design project really becomes the interface for talking about these complex processes and complex issues. And then, not just to design how things look, but also how things are governed. So to advocate for institutional adjustment, to actually actively change the sort of laws, policies, and institutions that we use to govern our territory. But also then the third one, to rely on proposition, to not just do research, but to actively propose visions, to propose narratives in order to have these conversations. If you want to know more about that, you can visit our website, Pantopia, pantopia.xyz, where you'll have a list of sort of our theoretical and conceptual frameworks, but also projects that we're continually uploading, sort of student projects. They're all 10-minute videos that you can watch. They're quite good, so have a look. And I thought I'd just show one or two examples. We're very much a design unit at our core. That's really something that we enjoy doing, but we want the design and both the construction of that design, the presentation of that design, to be the vehicle to carry that story.
As an alternative model with care, this stewardship anchor point establishes a socio-ecological landscape, and we can become the guardian, takes the stewardship to active against the national park border that isolate a piece of land forever in time and space. The loop establishes maintaining process that is not fixed nor dominated, but its connection and community landscape management. It encompasses various ecological conditions and ground activities as a socio-ecological network of conservation that allows the creation of alternative paths for reactivating its ecological potential through reclaiming and modifying several devices that have been neglected by our hand. The path, as a counteract to the determined infrastructural network, will be collectively created by not only following the existing hiking trail, disappearing local path, but also filling the gap between the trail and forestry network. The traces of inhabitation artifact will become the encounter points that reconnect this dispersed historical significance and ecological production together. The practice of creating the inhabitable path opens up the opportunity for collective protection. It no longer serves efficiency and consumption, but with scientifically grounded forestry principles, democratic political platform, and community management that cuts through the existing administrative boundary. The decision-making process includes discussion, testing different cultural traditions while incorporating the needs of humans and non-humans, and the encounter points and the path will be carefully designed and adapted to different topography and environment.
环境跟人的关系需要更积极或者正向的去创造那个连结。我们现在宁愿去发包2000万的步道工程，可是我们不愿意去培养一个社区的公班，让他就近去维护这些环境。
Therefore, this community disturbance framework offers a chance to disturb the history by bringing people back in decision-making, construction, and maintenance of nature.
Yeah, so I chose to show this clip by a current student, a student of mine who just graduated, Vic Sheng Ya Huang, because I think it encompasses a lot of these principles that I talked about, both from the scale of the territory to the designed object to the sort of political engagement that comes with that project.
As an alternative.
And all these things kind of come together a little bit in the brief that we're teaching here with Pablo. And I think now, because I've spoken for maybe a little bit too long, I'll leave the floor to Pablo, and Pablo, could you take it from here?
Sure. Yes, so thanks, Stefan and Man. It's an honor to be part of this public lectures program. My main background is in radical cartography, working with different activists and communities. So in early 2000, together with my collective Arquitectura and Indymedia, we created a new understanding of the geopolitical territory of the Strait of Gibraltar by placing the border at the center, visualizing the ongoing low-intensity war against migrants, and placing ourselves beyond nation-state political identities. In a recent project, we investigated the killing of Brazilian Black woman politician Marielle Franco, grasping a complex story of two instruments of assassination, its physical violence and the digital infrastructures and procedures that made it possible. So the map present in the same condensed page, the multiple layers and instruments involved in the murder, so human bodies, surveillance camera, WhatsApp groups, photograph lethal weapons, mobile phone screen, clone car license cars, Twitter account. So it was an attempt to map together necropolitics and technopolitics. The map is coming out next year in the Vertical Atlas. I've been interested lately in Anthropocene landscape investigations, such as in the interactive installation The Zone, about citizen science initiative following the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The project was shown at Laboral Art Center 2 years ago, and it was created in collaboration with artist Roman Torre. So the crisis of the Anthropocene raises fundamental questions of meaning, value, responsibility, and purpose in the face of global environmental change, calling for enlarged understandings of the entanglements between humans and non-human worlds. So it has been the focus of my work since 3 years ago, when I started teaching in the postgraduate department of architecture and urbanism in Federal University of Paraíba in Brazil, Northeast Brazil. So the country, Brazil, is now at the front line of a biodiversity attack by Bolsonaro genocidal and ecocidal government. The city where I teach is by one of the largest coral reefs in the world. Corals, essential to marine ecosystems, are affected by the increase in temperature and acidification of oceans caused by the greenhouse effect, by overfishing, water pollution, and coastal urban development. Of course, coral are an iconic species in the midst of the 6 massive extinction event going on, the extinction of plants, animals, an ecosystem is the extinction of biocultural relationships. We lost points of view, modes of sociability, and co-inhabitation. So responding to Donna Haraway's proposition of the Cthulhucene, the idea of making kin and symbiotic worlds, we understand our human identities and responsibilities within multi-species communities in relation to how design might better respond to the social, ecological, and ethical challenges posed by the Anthropocene. So we ask ourselves, how can architectural design articulate its core principles, ethics, and values in more than human being? And we made the case for a direction for architecture to engage with more than human thinking by mobilizing the notions of beyond human exceptionalism and multi-species attentiveness. So the critique of human exceptionalism challenges the persistent idea that human reason, meaning, knowledge making, and creativity, what humanists call culture, lies in raising above of our worldly and indeed our animal existence. So human exceptionalism have been described as a concept which blinds up to the world we co-inhabit with a multitude of early creatures and non-human agents. And I'm quoting here the thought of Anna Singh. So decentering human exceptionalism and imagining the alternatives imply tricky tasks two key tasks: to resituate the human in ecological terms and to resituate the non-human in ethical terms. And I'm quoting here the work of Donna Houston and a bunch of Australian geographers. So taking together these two tasks move us beyond a view of humans as autonomous individuals housed within sovereign bodies whose everyday actions somehow exist outside of ecological consequence into a co-emergent world based on intimate human, more than human relationship of responsibility and care. So the cartography of endangered corals, mangroves, and rivers was created in a 2 weeks open citizen workshop involving professors, 50 students, and activists. A map for the general public came out to raise awareness about predatory urban development and tourist industry and the many environmental crises the biodiversity in town is facing. It's also the intention of our courses to affect public life and to contribute to the protections of threatened environmental commons. So in that sense, the publication of the map was accompanied by direct action in the endangered corals. So the idea of multi-species city as a political pedagogical project started to take shape. So we move beyond human exceptionalism by reconsidering the human as the fundamental unit in architectural thinking, as in previous models from Leonardo da Vinci to Le Corbusier modular. So moving from the idea of the human as an ontological, homogeneous entity by replacing it with the idea of the holobeyond. So we change the perspective of the just human city to a multi-species city, starting to mobilize the idea of a non-human right to the city, started making field observations and hand drawings, like this one by Guilmar Queiroz of the Pajeú River in the state of Pernambuco, facing an environmental crisis because of regular urbanization. And from the Feral Atlas that came out last year, we learned that all event in human history has been a more than human event, and that the Anthropocene can be understood as the merge of infrastructures and ecosystems. Such as in the case of Carla Lombardo, that created a new map of the port of Suape near the city of Recife. And Porto Suape is the biggest industrial port in northeast Brazil. So learning from Feral Atlas, Anthropocene landscape detonators, Lombardo's map juxtaposed the stories of the Portuguese invasion and the colonial period with sugarcane plantations, slavery, but also the ongoing acceleration and the neo-extractivist period we are right now. And the multi-species attentiveness appear in the stories of the invasive brain coral species that travel inside the cargo containers and threaten the local species, which is the sand coral, or also the story of tiger sharks and bull sharks, whose ecosystems and reproduction areas were disrupted by the construction of the huge infrastructure of the industrial port 3 decades ago that changed their habits. So basically the nearby city of Recife is now top worldwide in shark attacks on humans. Or Carlos Pastor investigation about the infrastructure of golf courses across the coast of Alicante, in the Mediterranean, in Spanish Mediterranean coast, where paradoxically, although these residential and recreational complexes have completely transformed the surrounding ecosystem. The search for resources and energy they need has served to sustain the lives of dozens of species. Because of the opening of the water treatment plant has grown an orchard over the years with millions of liters of treated water ending in the sea. So let's say the tourists now they participate indirectly in the maintenance of a delicate ecosystem that was on the brink of extinction a few years ago. And this multi-species approach is becoming a trend in climate fiction. This book came out this year. Clarify multi-species ideas intersecting with the solar punk as a utopia that is an antidote to cyberpunk, a slogan now being high life, low carbon instead of high carbon, low life. So in our climate future course, students were asked to imagine solar punk utopias for the city of João Pessoa in terms of both adaptation to climate change and environmental justice. It was a short course in which, for example, Tuani Guedes imagined how to turn down the wall of gate communities and learn from the low tech of previous indigenous people living in that area. Lilian Leal created a new urban ecological vision for the fishing community of Porto Capim that is now under threat of eviction in the mangrove area of town. Barbara Lumi speculate about green platforms to protect corals and imagine new ways of farming. Or to give an end to my presentation, this proposal by student Alisa Piva, imagining a speculative infrastructure that at the same time protect the coast from erosion and nurture the corals to exist in the future as a solar punk utopia for the city of João Pessoa. Like developing relational understanding of architectural design as co-becoming in and for diverse multi-species communities where human, plant, soil, microbes, birds, fungi, insect, native and non-native animals shape landscapes and interactions, and where we are more attentive to the stories, a context of multi-species places within landscapes. So I think it was all on my side. So now we will be happy to engage in a conversation with all of you.
Yeah, and maybe just Pablo, could you go to the last slide, the next one? A lot of our sort of commonalities have come together in this brief, whether that's sort of an interest in multimedia or media art, whether that's an interest or an engagement with open source technology, with sort of an interest in activism, or in case of Pablo's, like really direct activism. And I think most importantly, there's to the brief that we wrote for the summer school, that it goes through the sort of theoretical sides of this discussion, but really we want to engage in an active proposition in order to promote or to discuss these new narratives and new visions for the future. And I think this idea of the production of new stories and new narratives is very present in both of our work, but we've also started to see it emerge very, very clearly in the work of the students. Paulo, could you please play? Just in the mural board and the things that we've been discussing in the last few days, which is that by looking or trying to find instances of biocultural heritage, the students have started to really to craft kind of either actively or inadvertently to craft very complex stories about movements of objects, of people, of material through time, and often through deep time and through space, and really allowing us to talk about it at the level of a continent down to the level of an object, and that's quite exciting. So we're really looking forward to seeing how this sort of now manifests in the next few days into design proposals. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Stefan. Thanks very much, Pablo. Thanks for sharing your work. I think that's a very interesting topics on how a lot of kind of interesting kind of using cartography to review kind of social, political, multi-species approach to land and environment. Mon, I'll invite Mon to kind of start off with the Q&A start. And I will just moderate any questions that's coming. So audience, if you have any questions for Stefan and Pablo, could you just put your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll try to moderate them.
Thanks for that presentation, Stefan and Pablo. And it's nice to see the sort of separation of what you guys do personally, but also coming together and how it's sort of manifesting within the studio. I think one of the main questions, maybe for both of you to maybe ask, because you are in this level of practice and education, the type of agency and type of project that you guys develop, because as a student, you do all these types of work, but then once you sort of graduate, you're like, well, how can I take this work? And, Pablo, you sort of do a book, like cartography of, feral atlases or things like that within ways to distribute the information or bring awareness to it or actually talk about it. Stefan, you sort of show different stories or narratives to maybe show a different light. But is there cases where, how has this affected change? How do you distribute information? How do you have any agency, I guess, outside the discourse of maybe just within the walls of architecture?
Yeah, I have a really short answer to that one, which is that I'm sort of, I guess my practice is fairly new in the sense that I was for a very long time working within the confines of an office, right, where there's a lot of frameworks and everything. So I'm actually still actively trying to figure out exactly those questions. But I think they do happen. Obviously, that agency happens within academia in terms of every single discussion that is had about these things, every single document that is produced, and every document or every discussion that is published, whether it is through this forum or an exhibition, or whether students we've encouraged some students to actually go and test out their projects in the real world just to see where they actually hit their physical boundaries. These things all become documents for everybody to use and to build upon. That was kind of the vision behind Pantopia. I don't know how many people view it every year, probably not as much as I'd like, but it's the idea that those are conversations that can be built upon, right? And that I think is also the nature of research, right? You produce research, and it's only through sharing extensively that eventually connections are made and agency sort of becomes a little bit more concrete. Like, I would say that in my case at the moment, I'm trying to set up a series of projects based on that initial research that has much more sort of concrete outcomes, like the construction of an assembly hall, or like the production of a video for the purposes of advocacy or something like that. But it's definitely, I would say it's definitely a challenge, and you need to kind of continuously try to build upon that. And it's really a question of aggregating information and building, and eventually it goes somewhere. But I'm curious to hear Pablo thinks.
Yeah, for me it's like the same. I'm still figuring out how to reply to what Armand was saying. I think so how it has created the kind of context and procedures and approaches for like interdisciplinary collaboration also with institutions, like with art centers, with local governments, in terms of like this merge of the arts and the science could support kind of more long-term initiatives. And that's what I would like to do next, to start to collaborate in medium scale project here where I live. But I think still in the, you say how to go beyond architecture or I think still, unless in the case, for example, of Northeast Brazil, I think this approach is kind of is a disruption in the sense that it's still architectural teaching is in a quite modernistic mode. I mean, there are a few teachers all around in places like Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo. So I think this more than human trend is quite new in academia. So first, like in my school, like students, they were asked to design. Sometimes even gate communities, like really. So I think like to understand the potential of biodiversity from in architectural teaching is still a task to do. I mean, it's not established, as in the curricula. So I think this marriage of architecture and environmental humanities is something that we need to do. We need to do as pedagogical project, and then when this is established, then let's go to next phase. But I'm doing a lot of effort in raising this question that, unless in my school, are quite unique, are quite new. So still, I think we are not in this phase that we how to move forward, or so we are still like setting the foundations for this perspective right now.
Because they're practically different types of practices that you guys are running that aren't traditional, right? So there needs to be different types of professionals within the groups that you're working within to actually develop these models or develop these projects or propositions. And it's just interesting to see how, you sort of toy this line between, trying to get agency within the community to having them as, romantic sort of projects that you're trying to, encourage and change the world in a way. And, the thing that I also wanted to touch upon, maybe more in case of you, Pablo, is that you propose a lot of, physicalization or objects for multi-species sort of, ecology. And I think, sometimes like all the projects that I've seen, when nature is most alive is places where we don't actually go, like Chernobyl or the DMZ. That's where nature and sort of things have really proliferated. And I wonder, maybe it's a sort of deeper question in the sense of, is it that to solve our problem, we have to build more, or is it to build less? And I think maybe something that, is always that idea of maybe mapping things out, maybe showing projects through these different ways to actually come to a better decision. Because as we learn more, and we're in a time right now where we can collect more data, right? Previously, people designed things and they thought that this would be the case, but it didn't turn out that way. So I guess that's maybe a question for you, Pablo, to like, what is your thinking behind that, and how do you deal with these issues, especially with today?
I definitely agree with you in the sense that we need to build less and definitely to rethink the kind of infrastructure that we really need for our living in terms of health, social services, and so on. So it's true that in my previous interest, I was more kind of focused on issues like environmental disasters and Fukushima and Chernobyl, but starting teaching in a place like Brazil, that I have to say is at the front line of the defense of planet Earth, in the sense like that it has the Amazon, it has the biggest tropical forest, it has the biggest water reservoirs in the world, it has the biggest biodiversity. At the same time, it's heavily attacked by a full kind of attack by a government, but also like transnational companies. So this issue of deforestation is serious, So I think like in the case of that city, like it was very natural, like very organic to approach the coral reefs from a spatial perspective and from the perspective of architectural designs, in the sense that de facto they want to start to build an infrastructure like a wall to protect the coast from erosion, like kind of concrete walls in dikes in the middle of the sea. So this is going to affect the the corals. The corals are not in the equation. So really there is an opportunity to thinking about design as I mean, it has to be confronted, and this perspective is like kind of real now at stake, and it needs to be at urgently, no? So I think there is definitely an opportunity. So it's not just about this case about exclusion zone, but really about cities and where we need to manage ecosystem and infrastructure right now in a different way, no?
I'm wondering if I could just build on what Mont was talking about in terms of the topics. And this, Stefan kind of mentions these notions of rural depopulations and land reconsolidations in Europe. I'm wondering, in terms of both Stefan and Pablo, your attitudes towards nature. I mean, there is this kind of a strange, as you were kind of describing, even through the drawings, through the media that you're actually showing today, there is almost a sense of artificiality inscribed into what is essentially natural system, or perhaps it's the other way around. I'm wondering whether you could perhaps clarify that positions for us.
Yeah, I think, I hope I'll be able to clarify it. Artificiality and natural systems. The thing is, between sort of emerging multidisciplinary ways of thinking, like multi-species thinking, and also even like the approach of rewilding, which is this idea that we revert large parts of land to be passively managed by certain animals. There is, in this, and in sort of like understanding the consequences of the Anthropocene, there is this notion that our fingerprint is on every single aspect of what we might want to consider wilderness or nature, but that because our fingerprint is everywhere, including the exclusion zone and including sort of the DMZ, which in a sense they're sort of flukes in a sense, but they're very much up against our own built environment, and they're only there because we decided certain things about them, or certain things about how they're managed. But overall, at a planetary scale, the damages are so big that there is a need to sort of accelerate a little bit maybe some of these processes of transformation. And there's a lot of thinking that's sort of coming around to thinking, well, we have a responsibility, a fundamental responsibility as, the species that has been wreaking havoc and extracting and damaging, to at least rethink a little bit of how we, produce and design our environment. Because the thing is, historically, in sort of not geological time, deep time, let's say, we have been very much actors on our land, whether it's through sort of burning of grasslands, whether it's the creation of spreading of particular seeds in the Amazon and things like that. But our relationship to that management has become extractive with sort of colonialism and capitalism, things like that. And that now we need to just revisit at least these approaches. But maybe to your question about artificiality, I don't know, Pablo maybe has a little bit of a different approach to that. I still probably am very much rooted in kind of like a European sort of planning and mapping and things like that. But the reason why that is that at least for the foreseeable future, a lot of these frameworks will still be used. And the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a spectrum of models that will exist, but some will become predominant. And so it's sort of upon us to at least try to carve out sort of niches in which other models can be tested out in order to avoid an intensification of a particular type of model, because that tends to be what happens regardless if things go unchecked, so to speak. And that will inevitably lead to, I think, the use of probably fairly standard sort of planning, mapping devices, but also new technologies like, citizen use of NDVI, photogrammetry, tracking, all these stuff that can be mobilized, for both nefarious purposes, but also, just as citizens, we need to keep track of the progress of the processes that we're taking, things like that.
Pablo?
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah.
I think that's a great crucial question, and I think since like I guess what the conversation could be enriched with is like any discussion on technology and artificiality, being confronted with a knowledge that previously was not considered knowledge as indigenous knowledge. No, I think it's great that you started the lecture by recognizing that you are in Melbourne, you are in the land in an indigenous land by these people that they were there before. And I think it's fascinating, and it's like politically extremely important. The way, for example, in Brazil, authors like Ailton Krenak and David Kopenawa, they are becoming scholars. I mean, they are publishing books that they're becoming bestsellers, like The Falling Sky by Kopenawa, which is he's a Yanomami chief, or Ailton Krenak. One of his latest books is called Ideas to Postpone the End of the World, and it's so interesting the way it's affecting all across discipline, like from activists to scholars. So this is unprecedented. It never happened before in the history of Brazil that there is so much attention to the indigenous thought. So it's the counterbalance. So we have Bolsonaro in the military and the government, and we have also like the counterpart that is. And one example is like I've seen like conversation in engineering thinking, okay, we are in this like a summit of engineers, how we engineers can learn from the ideas that are in this book by this indigenous leader, Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. I think this is revolutionary, and this is a discussion that needs to happen when we talk about technology and what artificial means, in the sense of, as Eduardo Viveiros de Castro says, I mean, previously we were considering like the Amazon people as primitive, but it's well known that the Amazon is anthropogenic because it has been like transformed by the human population. Like the most abundant tree in the Amazon is one that is mainly the food for. So there are settlements archaeological settlements with more than 4,000 people. So that the Amazon is anthropogenic, and the people living there, they didn't destroy nature, they didn't destroy the forest. No, so if we long term we want to have this planet, we really need to confront technology with that kind of thought. So I think this is for me, this is one of the most fascinating now trends in when thinking about technology, like engineers reading indigenous leaders. Not so that's my point about it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you say. I mean, I think there's so much knowledge that we should be seeing our environments from a kind of multi-dimensional kind of perspective, as opposed to what is traditionally singular. I think Christina yesterday very well put it, the white male perspective.
Definitely.
We have a couple of questions rolling in from our audience. Maybe I can pose some of them to you now. And one of them is about collaborations, and the question is around whether there's any collaborations with environmental specialists or perhaps other specialists or experts within your work.
Yeah, I mean, me, it's ongoing, but I have a strong sort of working relationship with the community of Froshan, so the village in Galicia. And while they are not what maybe a certain perspective might consider to be environmental experts, they are very much indigenous experts of their own land. And all of the work that they do is constantly done as a balance between sort of their contextual knowledge of their land and input that they take from academia, from scientists, from experts. But then obviously, like, as I continue to build, just like at my time at Forensic Architecture, like every time you engage in these collaborative projects, you need to get strong sort of collaborative partners to inform and complement your work. I mean, Pablo, for example, why Pablo is so crucial to the unit here is Pablo brings in sort of a theoretical dimension to these concepts that I might not have, for example. So I think you always find the perfect partner, and it kind of works out.
Yeah, and in my case, without the support and help of work of geographers, biologists, marine biologists, we would have not been able to produce those maps. So we did field research. We turned the rivers and corals into our classroom, and so it was crucial. At the same time, it was difficult to have a bigger framework because of, like, for example, currently the situation for public universities in Brazil is really bad, in the sense like last year 40% of the budget was cut. So we are doing in a kind of guerrilla style, but definitely this is the pathway to, and now for this work in the corals, we're starting to work with the specific marine biologists, and this is crucial. I all my students reading scientific papers in biology, and then contacting the authors, and then looking for collaboration, definitely.
Thank you. And there's a question, though these two questions are perhaps slightly related, posed by Nicholas on, it says, it seems difficult for students to aspire to be involved in architecture that aims to protect or restore the environment, mostly in the economic sense. And if possible, could you explain how these projects find fundings to be developed, and whether you find that there's any demands for this sort of practice, more so now than in the past?
Funding, how to find support and funding for architectural projects that encourage environmental restoration, right?
Yes.
Okay. I don't.
Or it could be completely self-initiated.
Right. Yeah, it's really difficult. It's really difficult, but there's the scale of a project really matters. Like for the purposes of research, and like whether it's research practice, artistic practice like this, there is funding for these sorts of initiatives out there, and you can get them, and there are institutions that are really interested in that. But then when it comes to sort of maybe at a more like a broader scale, like let's say the scale of a piece of land or the scale of a community, then there's entirely different mechanisms that kick in that you need to tap into as somebody who wants to do this sort of stuff. Whether that's like, for example, with the community of Roshan, we're looking to develop or renovate an old mining building on their land to become an assembly hall, and immediately there is all these other sort of sources of funding that open up that have to do with overlapping sort of agricultural practices with cultural practices or artistic events and things like that. So creating dynamic cultural life. But then there's obviously funding, at the level of the region, at the level of the EU for these types of projects. It's just they're not specifically directed towards architecture. Like, you tend not to go there and say, I want to do architecture for a certain thing. It's usually about, you have to phrase the project a little bit differently.
Well, in the case of Brazil, basically there is no funding, and this is also like a discussion that sometimes I have with my students, saying, kind of when you finish your studies and you're gonna face your professional career, this is gonna be tough. But at the same time, that it was one of the countries more impacted by coronavirus because of the government negating the pandemic. So I think this is the scale of the problems is so big right now. But I'm encouraging the students. So you produce this work, it goes into your portfolio, and let's try to find a scholarship in Europe or where you could have the chance to develop to your projects with some support. No. In the past, there was support in the past by the Brazilian Minister of Culture and some institutions, but right now it's really extreme. Maybe it will change in 10 years or 20.
Or if you have a lot of money, you can just go and buy land and do exactly what I said we shouldn't do in the beginning. Self-initiated.
So there's one last question from Stephen Poon that we can ask is, what are proactive ways to support existing ecological, economic, and social cultural relationships, enabling continuity of biocultural heritage?
Complex question.
That's a good question, yeah. Go for it.
Question. Yeah,
maybe we can look at it on like an individual level and maybe on a collective level as well. Maybe you can look at it in different scales.
Yeah. I mean, there's many ways that one can do that, but from personal experience, the way that we can do that is, I don't know. From personal experience, in the case of Foshan, the very act of actually going somewhere and sharing and engaging with other groups, sharing information, engaging in sort of like a participative or a collective action, and I think creating collaborative links, like that's already like a lot of work in itself. After that, it depending on what your project is, it's there's all kinds of avenues for working on a specific aspect of that question. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe that's a bad answer. Pablo, maybe you have a better answer.
I'm looking for the answer now, but which is like what kind of forum, like for potentials of biocultural, like heritage and economy, like I think I would like to know some answer. What kind of forums could we inspire, or in the sense of for example, like political forensic architecture, develop the idea of a forum, no, and then you start to interact with different agencies, no, like for example, in my context that I'm in a region north of Spain that is in industrial decay, like environment, like economic crisis, but at the same time there is a huge environmental potential because we have water. Climate change is not going to affect this region until 2100. So at the same time, how can we introduce these ideas of biocultural heritage that will be a kind of an advance from the idea of just sustainability or just like green economy? Or I'm really curious because I think somehow it's not there yet. When we talk with people that could support this initiative, like let's say politicians, or let's say like even like deans in universities. So I still is not very clear for me how to approach a kind of more like bigger actors, in the sense like how can we create this forum in the sense that they will understand that there is economic let's say potential in the medium long term, no? So I would like to know what the guy that was asking what is he doing at the moment in that sense, because I would like to learn also from others.
and to bounce off of Pablo's answer, once again learning from forensic architecture a little bit, it's a first step, I think, which is really crucial, is simply like the act of recording and presenting that a thing as being biocultural heritage back to a given forum. And the reason why that is like we've explained in our sessions as a group here, that the notion of what is biocultural heritage itself, what is the thing that we choose to value or we choose to sort of enhance, or that is very much a subjective perspective, depending on who is actually looking at any given topic, what lens we're seeing a subject through. There is a need anyway at first to simply learn to revisit and to revalue and to recommunicate, so to speak, instances of biocultural heritage, so that from there we can start to build and we say, well, this is actually a practice that is worth sort of learning more about. It is worth deploying in these places. Actually, we've stopped doing this here, but we're going to start again. And we have this body of knowledge that's been done by somebody who's recorded it to do it. It's a really long, gradual process, my guess is.
Absolutely. I think what is super fascinating about this is that we are sort of giving these weak signals out of things that are happening today that people might not be picking up on just yet. But, like the sort of weak signals of like, different types of ecologies, like dying, different types of fauna dying. Like these are signs that we should start picking up on. And the ways that you guys are tackling it is maybe one of the first ways of actually having these conversations, but also having a talk about how to have agency. I think maybe one way to answer that question of proactiveness is actually know where things come from, where you're drinking your water from, what's actually happening in the outside world, because we're so insular. And especially in lockdown these days, the things that we touch there's trails to them. There is a bio sort of effect to it in so many of the things that we do, that the first thing is to understand. And I think the stuff that you guys are mapping, opening out the free speech of Pantopia.xyz to actually, not hide it away from people, not like let's open up the research, build on top of what we have. You can take it from us, and we as a collective can share these things, can actually maybe one day, as Pablo said, in 10 years, this will become front and foremost. And for some reason, the government will provide funding for it, but we're ready and prepared. I think that's the way maybe we can approach it. And I think, scholars and stuff throughout our time have always sort of thought beyond just what is in our face right now. So maybe that's a way the unit itself could tackle, and maybe we can have a discussion maybe in 10 years. But on that note, I really wanted to thank Stefan and Pablo. Yeah, no, as in we can actually deploy these, right? So hopefully we can actually have some agency before that. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for that, and at least opening the eyes of how we can actually tackle these types of things in new ways of architects that we can practice, and also maybe considering a bit more outside the scope, and the different problems and relationships that we have with nature can be evolved a bit better.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the very thought-provoking kind of lectures. So audience, we have a series of lectures coming up. This is our second lectures. Tomorrow's we're going to have our third lectures for the week, and it will be by Daniela Lichtenberger and Tiziano Derma on 90 tongues, 656 hours, 51 elements, 20 people. This is on their latest installation at the Architecture Biennale in Venice, titled The Magic Queen. Daniela and Tiziano was also unit leader last year at the AA Visiting School. And as part of that event, tomorrow night is also our MSDX, which is the Melbourne School of Design winter exhibitions, end of semester exhibition. So please join us online, and Daniela and Tiziano's lectures will be concurrent with this event. So please register online via the MSDX website, and it will take you to interactive platforms where you can enter multiple events. Next week, join us again on Monday, on the 12th of July, either on campus at the Melbourne School of Design or online for Stella, lecture titled Embodiments, Aliveness, Agency, Zombie, Cyborg, and Chimeras. Following that, on Tuesday, we have Adolfo de Valnera and Oscar Johansson's titled Unnatural Disaster. And Adolfo and Oscar is also one of the unit leaders this year for the AA Visiting School. And to wrap up our AA Visiting School public lecture series, we have Emmanuel Cole closing for us next Wednesday on the 14th of July on AI sampling on plasticities and form. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight for Stefan and Pablo's, and we'd like to thank you, Stefan and Pablo, again for the amazing lecture. Thank you. Good night.